And welcome to part 2 of your chapter 3 lecture. So now we're going to focus on some of the last few sections of the chapter. So this is picturing the here and now. So the social order, the world of the sacred, histories, and great stories of the past, all of these are very grand and important themes. But art does not necessarily always have to reach so high. Sometimes it is just enough to look around us and notice what our life is like here now in this place at this time. So a lot of times, people think, the old saying is, don't worry about the past or the future, just enjoy the present. And I think a lot of that is very important. I think a lot of times we do get so caught up in what happened in the past or what's to come in the future. And I think a lot of times we don't focus on the now and what we want and what's to come, and what we're doing at this moment. We're like, what's the next big thing? What's the next big art movement? What's the next big style to come out? And sometimes that's not the focus. Sometimes the focus is just like, what is going on right here, right now in this community, in this culture, at this school, at this institution for me. And how can I be involved in a part of that process? So as we look at this artist here, Rauschenberg was a very well-known artist. Hopefully, maybe you've heard of him, maybe you haven't. But living in New York in the 1960s, Robert Rauschenberg found that visual impact of daily life had outgrown the ability of any single image to convey it. He liked to communicate the energies and vitality of his time and place. So often he treated his canvas, as you can see here, like a giant page in a scrapbook. So it kind of has this idea of what is like a controlled chaos. To me, it's kind of like, if you've ever seen people who are just kind of, maybe they're somewhere like in a park or something and you see them kind of sketching something out. Maybe they're sketching a drawing of what they're going on in their mind. Maybe they're actually drawing something that they see. Maybe they've sat down to look at the water or something in the park and they're drawing it. They're just drawing what they see and they're enjoying that time and moment. And a lot of times, if people are in maybe a good mood while they're drawing that, or maybe in a good mood while they're creating or writing or whatever they're doing in that time period, then that sketchbook or that page allows them to go back and reflect on that. And I think that's also an important concept, like I said, picturing the here and now. So this image in particular is called Windward by Rauschenberg. The photographic images are drawn from many sources. There's images of the Statue of Liberty, a bald eagle against a rainbow, the Sistine Chapel with Michelangelo's famous frescoes, sun-kissed oranges, Manhattan rooftops, and their distinctive water towers, building facades, and construction workers in plaid shirts and hard hats. So part of the pleasure of as viewers lies in kind of, teasing and kind of playing out these visual and conceptual connections. Kind of understanding what is going on in this artwork and what exactly is Rauschenberg trying to explain to us. Rauschenberg liked the names of all the images he used. He often would use these works. He was very much into these kind of collage effects, and he felt that it allowed him to gather a little bit of the here and now. So think about that when it talks about picturing the here and now. So this is focusing on reflecting on the human experience. Often a lady of the imperial court and artist in 16th century Mexico would have had very different lives than that of an Egyptian official. They would have also had different stories. They would have worshipped different deities. They would have seen different sights and had different understandings of the world and their place in it. All of us are born. We pass through childhood. We mature. We search for love. We grow old and we die. We experience doubt and wonder, happiness and sorrow, loneliness and despair. Surely one of the most common of human wishes is to talk. If only we could for a brief moment be or visit with someone who is no longer here. Many religions embrace the idea that the dead form a vast spirit community capable of helping us, and many rituals have been devised to honor ancestors and appease their spirit. But we know all the rituals in the world do not compensate for the ache we sometimes feel when we wish we could speak to those who came before us, to tell them what we have become, to ask for their guidance, to compare experiences, to explain, or merely to just listen. So this artwork here by Meta Warwick Fuller is called The Talking Skull. This was created in 1937. You see this figure kneeling before the skull, naked and vulnerable. The boy seems to hear an answer to the plea. On one level, the talking skull embodies a universal message about the desire for communion and community beyond the boundaries of our brief lifetime. So, often people are like, oh, if I only had a little bit more time, and then there's the I don't want to say kind of a cliche saying of, people say it's not the date on each side of the grave or the markings that matters. If it's 1900 to 2000, it's the dash in between that matters. What experiences did they have, or how did they touch people's lives and things like that. But I also think there's this idea, that people, especially people who are very close to certain individuals, may truly lose a part of themselves when that person dies. That person was woven into their life, in however way, whether it was a family member, a friend, anything of that sort. People are like a pattern quilt, and they kind of weave themselves in. Some people stay for a while, some people don't, but every person has a little bit of each person they've encountered, kind of weave into their pattern of life. And so, you have to think when these people pass on, how that can be how it can affect many people, and that's something that you want to be mindful of. So Fuller was actually a pioneering African American artist. Born in 1877, she pursued her artistic training in both the United States and Europe, mastering the conservative academic style that brought mainstream recognition to artists in her day. Like many of her generation, she sought out things that would help American blacks reconnect with and take pride of their American heritage. So as you look at Fuller's sculpture, you enter into the boy's thoughts through empathy. Fuller counts on this ability, and her artistry, facilitates it by giving us numerous clues: the pose, the nakedness, and the intense gaze. So even though this is focusing on African American history, I think she also makes it a universal piece, so that anyone can, identify that, maybe you're a young child, or even, to parents or anyone older than you, or especially a family member, you will always be a child in their eyes. So it's this idea that this young individual, is kind of looking and talking to this skull, and they just want to have one more conversation. They just want to hear their voice one more time. They just want them to listen to them maybe one more time, or maybe they need that advice or that guidance. Moving on to Johannes Vermeer, which is Woman Holding a Balance. Oh, excuse me, let me go to the next slide. So this is by the Dutch painter Johannes Vermeer, this very kind of quiet masterpiece. There's this idea that stillness pervades this picture. You see this kind of gentle half light being filtered through this curtain window, and reveals this woman contemplating an empty jeweler's balance. She holds the balance, and it's kind of got these two trays, delicate. She's holding it with her right hand, and it kind of falls in the exact center of the composition. The figure is a little bit off to the right, and this actual balance is what kind of draws our attention to the exact center of the composition. And then the image that's drawn on the background here of the artwork also kind of catches the light. The painting is actually of the Last Judgment, which according to Christian beliefs, Christ shall come again to judge, to weigh souls. As you look at some of the different items throughout, you can kind of see that idea of the human experience. Light too is a very reflective idea. The mirror reflects. It's reflected into the surface of the mirror, and then the mirror suggests this idea of self-knowledge. There has been a lot of debate about whether the woman is pregnant, or whether the fashion of the time period simply made her appear so. Her form evokes the sense of pregnancy, this miracle of birth, and the renewal of life. So if we think about birth, death, and the decisions, this one in contrast to the sculpture that we just looked at, weighing in on our journey through life, the temptations of vanity, the problems of self-knowledge, the question of life after death, is very much touched on in most, and is often understood through these use of paintings and sculptures. And I think that's where art has such a benefit for individuals, to allow us to interpret those concepts, as well as allow us to create our own ideas and thoughts about how to create those as well. Once again, going back to the picturing the here and now, focusing on now and maybe drawing those images and understanding what's going on there. Okay, focusing on invention and fantasy. So Renaissance theorists often likened painting to poetry. A lot of artists, I cannot remember exactly who said it, but one artist said if there was, if I could say it in words, there would be no need to paint. So a lot of times I like to think of painting as this visual poetry, and that's why we talked about earlier about stories and people taking words and then putting them into a visual effect. And I think that's very important to focus on as well. So, with words, a poet could conjure an imaginary world and fill it with people and events, but a painting was even better because it could often bring this imaginary world to life before your eyes. Like I said, that idea of universal language, that idea, that a child and an adult could look at a work of art in the same way. One of the most kind of bizarre and inventive artists was the Netherlandish painter Hieronymus Bosch. And when we first encounter his garden of earthly delights, which is the image that we see here, we think we might have wandered into a fun house of kind of this, very type of artwork, and we're just like, is this really true? This was created in 1505 to 1510, so this was definitely a little more uncommon for this time period here. The two outer sections are painted both front and back and can close like a pair of shutters over the central image, which are these two images here that we see. And the idea is to illustrate the earthly paradise of Eden on the left and hell on the right, and between Eden and hell, Bosch set the Garden of Earthly Delights, which depicts the false paradise of love, false because although deeply pleasurable, it can lead humanity away from the bonds of marriage toward the deadly sin of lust. And so you see a lot of these nude humans. They're inhabited by these giant plants, these oversized birds and animals. People are very busy and inventive in the things they do and with one another. It's a very almost kind of chaotic scene that we're looking at here with this artwork. So can this really be delightful? We look at the title, The Garden of Earthly Delights. To me, it kind of seems a little bit chaotic. I'm not sure that I would consider that to be delightful or serene by any means. But the idea was that, this earthly paradise, and, everybody's kind of freely going around and doing these sinful things and everything's lustful, so there is a way that you can, be both intrigued, but also repelled by the artwork at the same time. And I think that's what this one kind of talks about here. So the artist, in comparison, Giovanni Battista Piranesi, who created the Sawhorse, this was done in 1761, and this is an etching. This uses a printmaking technique known as etching, and he called the 16 prints in this series the prison, and explained that they were various inventions from his own imagination. The etchings pictures were underground prison of space with stairways to nowhere and very soaring dark vaults. We kind of see this architecture from a low vantage point to emphasize its size. And the artist often filled his frightening spaces with machines and tiny figures. After printing an initial run or state of the prints, the artist returned to his images and made them even darker and more ominous, like the one seen here. He would often add elements like chains, ladders, and spiked objects that looked more like torture devices. He also liked to create these etchings in response to the Enlightenment's celebration of reason. So his work was actually in anticipation of the movement that is known as Romanticism, that would soon react to the rationality of Enlightenment with stories of monsters and high keyed emotion. So I think this artwork is very, very inventive, and I think it portrays a lot about, it's kind of a foreshadowing event. Once again, that idea that it's influential to another style or time period of art that we may not necessarily think about or understand, but all these works are being influenced by the works before them. Moving on to the natural world. As humans, we make our own environment, from the first tools of the earliest hominids to today's towering skyscrapers. We have shaped the world around us to our needs. This manufactured environment, though, has its setting in quite a different environment, that of the natural world. Nature and our relationship to it are themes that have often been addressed to throughout art. So this is Thomas Cole. This is shortly known as the Oxbow. This was done in 1836, and it is an oil on canvas painting. So oftentimes during the 19th century, many American painters would often set themselves within the American landscape as the subject. One of these artists was Thomas Cole, who was a young man who had immigrated to America from England. He painted the Oxbow, which was this great looping bend or oxbow of the Connecticut River, as seen from the heights of nearby Mount Holyoke. in Massachusetts. To the left, you see this violent thunderstorm darkening the sky, and then as it emerges to the right, you see this sunlight after the storm. Fields have been cleared. Cole actually developed the painting in a studio from a sketch he had made at the site. Excuse me. But he did incorporate himself into the artwork. I don't know if you can see it. If you Google the image, you can see him right here. The artist included himself in the work. He's showing the painting in progress, and he kind of looks at us up over his shoulder. He thought that it was a more effective composition by using the image and creating it in his studio. There was this idea too of kind of a half and half of, we talked about being in the present, or focusing on art that's here and now, not necessarily in the past or in the future. So I think this is also kind of an interesting foreshadowing of the darkness may come, but the light will also come. And it's this idea of if you kind of cut the painting in kind of a diagonal half, you begin to see that there are these dreary and dark time periods that we go through as communities, cultures, countries, individuals, families, etc. But there's always this brightness on the other side. There's always that light at the end of the tunnel, as they say. And so I think that makes it very interesting. The other thing about the natural world is also how we can literally use the items around us that are outside to create these works of art. And we'll look at that especially in these next two images. I think they are very captivating in terms of literally using the land and the earth that was given to us in order to create art, not even necessarily having to go through a painting or a drawing of some sort or write our ideas down in a sketchbook, but physically using the land, maybe manipulating it a little bit, depending on the subject and how it works, but using that as part of these kind of installation and techniques and sculptures. So as we look at the Rohanji Temple, this is a stone and gravel garden. This work itself is very interesting. It's in Kyoto, Japan. It's placed at the Buddhist temple of Ryoanji, and it seems to occupy a position kind of halfway between sculpture as well as landscape gardening. This was created toward the end of the 15th century and maintained continuously since. The garden consists solely of 5 groupings of rocks set in a rectangular expanse of raked white gravel and is surrounded by an earthen wall. A simple wooden viewing platform runs along one side. Over time, moss has grown up over the rock groupings, and oil in the clay walls has begun to seep into the surface, forming these patterns that call to mind traditional Japanese ink paintings of landscape. This is a place of meditation, and viewers are invited to find their own meaning in it. So this one's very interesting. There have been a lot of interpretations about this artwork as well, about the different concepts with these little islands and the raking. Actually had my students in one of my classes, I had a student who actually made this for one of their projects for the unit that we were studying at the time. And they talked about, the garden was based on meditation. So they actually bought sand and kind of sprinkled and glued it to a box to create a rendition of this Rohanji garden. And they took a fork and a little comb and they were kind of raking. And they said it was very meditative. And they also said it was very interesting. Oftentimes people, when I talk about warm and cool colors and when I kind of use those comparisons, I often use things of nature to compare them to. And when I talk about cool colors, which are the greens, the purples, the blues, and other colors within that color palette, and family, I'm like, oftentimes when we go to a beach or a lake or even just a body of water in general, we may have this sense of calming come over us. It's not necessarily that maybe we don't even get in the water, maybe we don't even touch it. It's just that idea of looking and that sense of nature, that idea of that fresh air. Or maybe it's the mountains, maybe those kind of blue, gray, cold mountains. Maybe that's where you find serenity and peace and calm. Maybe it's not water or the beach for you. But I do think it's very interesting how nature continues to evolve with us, just as art continues to evolve. So it's not, yes, we want to focus on capturing and documenting parts of history, but I also think there's something about the artwork evolving with us as humans as we evolve as well, as we change from, one century to the next, from one generation to the next, and how we can be transformed like that. And I really think the next one is very interesting to talk about that. So this is the Spiral Jetty, this was created by Robert Smithson. This is located in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. First created in April 1970. It consists of black rock, salt crystals, earth, and red water algae. This work itself is an earthwork built by this American artist. Smithson had become fascinated with the ecology of salt lakes, especially with the microbacteria that tinge their water shades of red. After viewing the Great Salt Lake in Utah, he leased a parcel of the land on its shore and began to work on this large coil shape of a landscape. Similar to the gardens at the Rwangi, Spiral Jetty continued to change according to the natural processes after it was finished. Salt crystals would often accumulate and sparkle on the edges. Depths of the water would be in and around to show the different tints of transparent, violet, pink, and red. Spiral Jetty was submerged, by the rising waters of the lake soon after it was created, but following droughts in the early 2000s, it resurfaced and was transformed by a coating of salt crystals. So the thing that was interesting about this, if you see how it's connected to the shore over here, so you can actually walk out onto this sturdy piece of land, but you have to make sure that the tide and the water around it, there's specific times that you can do that, or otherwise you will be caught out there and you won't be able to get back. So that is also that idea of, the natural world and how, similar to the Rwangi gardens, like we were just talking about, art is evolving and changes with us instead of changing against us. This one in particular, I think, is very interesting because it's literally, the Rwangi garden is also part of the earth, but it's kind of contained. It can be maintained a little bit easier. This one is kind of like, when he created it, he had to work on timing. And, as we go throughout the course of time over these many, many years, this work has been diminished and disappeared, and then it's resurfaced, and then it's come back, all because of this idea of evolution and all this of how the changing of the world around us. And so the idea that art itself does that for us, I think is very, very interesting. Okay, and then the last section that we're going to talk about briefly is art about art and its institutions. So artists learn to make art by looking at art. So I want you to think about that. I'm going to repeat that. Artists learn to make art by looking at art. So if you ever hear an artist that say they don't like to look at other people's works, or they don't like to visit museums, or they don't like to go to block shows or things like that, they may or may not be telling you the truth. But oftentimes, if you see somebody do something enough, whether you consider yourself to be an artist or not, you're probably going to pick up on a few things, whether it's art, whether it's math, English, whatever it may be, whatever the subject or focus that it may be at the time. You learn about art, though, by looking at art. And the look of the art of the past is to learn about the predecessors, and the look at the art of the present is to situate themselves amid its currents and get their bearings. So we've talked about a bunch of different artists that's, raising questions about self and the nature of creativity. But when you think about art itself, it's about learning, making, and viewing it. And it's also about the nature and social settings and about specific movements and styles of art as well. So this last work that we're going to look at is very interesting. If you're familiar with some of the other works, this is a kind of a play on words from previous works of art. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. So this work is from the Guerrilla Girls, titled "Do Women Have to Be Naked to Get into the Met Museum?" This was created in 1989. This is a screen print on paper. So this one, was very interesting and noted the underrepresentation of women artists in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. So the idea was, artists often, many, many years ago and many centuries ago, would often paint nude females, so the controversy cliche was, is that what they have to do in order to get in the museum? Because there were these male dominant figures happening during the time, and a lot of female artists in particular were not being represented. Like I said, they were being underrepresented throughout these museums. So this poster uses a photograph of a painting by 19th century French artist Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres to represent the abundance of women's bodies displayed in museums. A gorilla mask is then imposed over the head as the Guerrilla Girls wore this kind of mask when they appeared in public. This poster drew attention to art institutions that promoted white male artists but ignored other women and minority artists. The work achieved almost an instant chic, partly because of their excellent graphic design and partly because of the Guerrilla Girls' aura of mystery, and the group remains active today. So there is something to be said about art and its institutions, and kind of making that statement. Art is about making a statement, whether that's a political statement, a personal statement, a professional statement. So I do think this is a very interesting concept. By doing this, by being proactive in their abundance of wanting to promote women and these minority figures, they were able to actually get those underrepresented groups then represented in museums. And as we know today, many of those groups may still be underrepresented at times, but they are becoming more prominent alongside the traditional white male dominant artists that were most often displayed in museums or galleries or portrayed throughout many of the events. So, don't be afraid for yourself as an artist, especially to reach out and to kind of promote yourself or a group of people, especially if you feel that they are being underrepresented. I think that's important as well when you're talking about art and its institutions. It could be something as simple as a gallery or a block show, or it could be something like a museum. There's that importance about understanding art, and I think also the representation of different cultures. It helps artists themselves learn about other artists, but also thinks it helps local communities and cultures learn about each other as well. And they're not just focused on maybe who they surround themselves with daily, but maybe learn something different about different cultures, different people throughout the world, or maybe even people who are in their communities and they just learn a little bit more about them. So this concludes the end of the Chapter 2 lectures, and I will see you guys next time.